When you want to understand Jesus, it's important to listen to what he says, of course. He means what he says, and we ignore it at our own peril. But it's even more important to watch what he does, and especially what he does when life interrupts what he was planning to do. Now, most often, he plans to spend his day teaching. He has a lot that he wants to say to all different people as he travels around through many different areas. If you notice, though, his teaching plans often get set aside. People bring sick people to him, and he stops what he's doing and he takes care of them. He might even leave the crowd altogether, wherever they are, and follow someone home because they have a sick person at home. Over and over again, the stories in the gospel are interruption stories. They start with Jesus getting interrupted and then choosing what to do in that moment. Now, today's story is another of the interruption stories. But it's not a healing story, it's a feeding story. And he was gonna keep teaching, but he realized the group's hungry. Now, all four Gospels tell this story. Some say 5,000, some say 4,000, because just whatever it was, everybody was amazed at this moment. It became one of the stories most told of Jesus as his history was recounted. But it wasn't told just because of Jesus' seeming magic abilities. This is a story about Jesus' good heart for people in need. It's also the Gospel of John's version, the "we can't afford this" version of the story. I like this version. It's real. The problem of trying to follow Jesus, of course, is that the scale of human need is so overwhelming. Even today, when Pope Francis calls on Europe to deal with its immigration issues, Europe feels overwhelmed by the scale of it. And that's today's reading too. Jesus wants the apostles to do something, and their response to him is a financial one. Even 200 days' wages, we couldn't feed the crowd. They're right. It's just not how Jesus thinks of it. And that raises a question. How do we know when we've done enough to satisfy this part of Jesus' teaching? What's enough when it comes to caring for the poor? Do we get to say to God, "Don't ask more of us, we're doing enough"? Someday, when we go to the famous pearly gates, do we actually intend to say to our Creator, "Well, I loved the poor at the yearly contribution level that I set"? Is that enough? What's enough when you say you're following Jesus and he lets himself be interrupted by just about every presenting need that comes along? Now, the apostles today proposed a limit that Jesus rejected out of hand, but surely there's some limit. It's not fair, of course. If Jesus can multiply bread and fish with the wave of his hand, there's not a lot of out-of-pocket costs there. And if he can heal people just by laying hands on them, he doesn't have to worry much about funding a healthcare system. Our approach, of course, has been multi-layered. It begins with your own charity, from your own personal resources. And it gets extended by the work that you do here together through the Catholic Center. You bundle donations from each other and you direct it to human need here and abroad. But let me make you even prouder. Do you know that 1 out of 4 Americans, people in poverty, 1 out of 4 people in poverty in America get their services from the Catholic Church? Whether it's Catholic Charity or the St. Vincent de Paul Society. Do you know that 1 out of 6 Americans gets their health care from Catholic health care? All those Catholic hospitals all over the country? Do you know that the Catholic Church is the largest provider of private K-12 education in the country? Do you know it's the largest provider of private higher education in the country? It's the largest provider of refugee resettlement, even larger than the government itself. Catholic Relief Services is the world's largest source, is among the world's largest source of emergency relief, and it's entirely funded by U.S. Catholics. The social ministries of the Catholic Church are the largest single source of social good in this nation, outside of the government itself. That's not a judgment, that's the numbers. But let me make you even prouder still. When 50% of the elderly were slipping into poverty in 1935, the U.S. created payroll taxes and built Social Security, a safety net, so that the elderly would not have to starve. When 1/2 of the elderly of this country were in poverty and couldn't afford both food and rent and had to choose, we stepped up as a country and said, let's create a safety net, and we did. In 1954, they added a provision so that the disabled who could not possibly work could have a small income. In 1965, Medicare was added so that the elderly could at least get a modest level of health care if they couldn't afford it. Medicaid was added for the poor to at least get a modest level of health care. CHIP was created in the 1990s so that 8 million children from poverty could get health care. And yes, the Affordable Care Act was added a few years ago to those who could either no longer afford health insurance for their treatments or medications. It forbade the insurance companies from denying people because of previous conditions. 11 million people benefited. Provisions within it, it still exists, provisions within it have been unwound in recent years. But there's a strong national agreement on both sides of the aisle that people shouldn't be denied health coverage because of pre-existing conditions. And I have no doubt that this debate is going to continue until we find some approach to some of this. Now, you may have many complaints about these programs, so do I. But I know this, that my retired parents are able to survive because of Social Security. They worked their whole lives, but now in their 80s, that's helping them get by. My 81-year-old father just spent 4 weeks in a hospital, and he's now a guest of a rehabilitation center where they're trying to help him walk again. Frankly, he'd be dead by now if Medicare didn't help him pay for his medications and for his treatment. My sister, who is mentally disabled, was able to live in a simple group home because she is completely unable to work because of SSI, Social Security. I'll tell you right now, without those programs, my family would be poor. They would have lost their home paying for health care. At 81 years of age, my parents would have run out of their retirement savings by now. In 1935, 1/2 of the elderly in America were unable to pay for housing and food. God bless Social Security. We may need to fix it, but we'd be in a terrible fix without it. So there's the problem. Our politicians complain about these programs. We complain about these programs. None of us like to pay taxes for them. But it turns out that many of us would be poor without them. And it turns out that the hero of today's story of the feeding of the crowds was only partly Jesus. We saw Jesus' good heart on display for sure. We saw his priorities for sure. Human need comes first. We even saw him collect leftovers so that they could be put to good use. All of that's true. But it turns out that the hero of the story today was a boy who happened to have 2 fish, 5 loaves of bread, and was trusting enough to say that he'd share what little he had. His answer to the human need around him was simply, "Here, take mine." Now, Jesus doesn't say build large government programs. He doesn't tell the Catholic Church to build extensive social ministries. He doesn't even tell the Catholic Center at Wash U to do charitable work together. But he does insist that we take care of each other. And then he leaves it to us to figure out. And so, right now at least, that's how we do it. Individuals volunteer and donate. Local churches do something for their neighborhoods. The church as a whole does bigger things, and we use our taxes to do the biggest things. That's our solution. The gospel doesn't actually care how we do this. But if we're going to suggest that we stop doing any of these things, then we have to figure out what we do instead. Republican, Democrat, that doesn't matter if you're a, quote, follower of Jesus. What matters for a follower of Jesus is that there's no monetary answer to the question. What's enough? All we have is Jesus' inexhaustible willingness to be interrupted by human need, and that little boy's stunning act of saying, "Here, take mine."